Every single day in the UK, 11 people die from drug poisoning. 11 families destroyed. 11 futures extinguished. Behind each death is a story, a mother who won't see her children grow up, a father who won't walk his daughter down the aisle, a child who becomes one of the hundreds orphaned every year by this epidemic. In 2020 alone, over 4,000 people in the UK died from avoidable drug overdoses. Their families never got to say goodbye. January 29, 2020. Keel services on the M6 motorway in Greater Manchester. Stephen King, a 42-year-old lorry driver, pulls into what he thinks is just another routine rest stop. He has no idea that specialized police units have been watching his every move for months. In the back of his HGV, 10 pallets stacked with 25-kilogram bags of rice. The kind you'd find in any supermarket. The kind that should feed families, not destroy them. But these bags weren't feeding anyone. Hidden inside was 1 ton of pure heroin and ketamine. Street value, £300 million. Enough drugs to potentially cause thousands more deaths. Enough poison to shatter thousands more families. The largest mainland drug seizure in British history. Stephen King thought he was about to complete the perfect crime. His partners, Andrew Tate and Craig Parr, believed they had built an unbreakable criminal empire. Together, these 3 ordinary-looking men had created what could have been the UK's deadliest drug disaster. But they made one fatal mistake that would cost them everything and save countless lives in the process. This is their story. Stephen King didn't look like a criminal mastermind. At 42, he was just another lorry driver navigating Britain's motorways, delivering goods across the country. But King had something that made him invaluable to organized crime. He understood exactly how cargo moved through the UK's transportation network. He knew which routes attracted the least attention, which rest stops were safest for transfers, and most importantly, which types of cargo customs officials barely bothered to inspect. Andrew Tate, also 42, was the strategist. While King handled transportation, Tate brought the organizational skills that could turn a simple drug smuggling operation into a systematic criminal enterprise. He understood that the key to avoiding detection wasn't just hiding the drugs, it was creating an entirely legitimate-looking business operation around them. Craig Parr, 43, completed their criminal triangle. He had the connections to suppliers and understood street-level distribution. Where King knew transportation and Tate knew organization, Parr knew the drug trade itself, the dealers, the territories, the prices, and the routes that would turn their imported product into millions of pounds in profit. Together, these 3 men discovered something that had eluded law enforcement for years: how to hide in plain sight. Their weapon of choice wasn't violence or intimidation, it was bureaucracy. They would beat the system by becoming part of it, using legitimate businesses as cover for the largest drug importation network in British history. By 2018, King, Tate, and Parr had found what they believed was the perfect solution to every drug dealer's nightmare: secure communication. EncroChat promised military-grade encryption that would make their conversations invisible to law enforcement. Each phone cost £1,500 with an annual subscription of £1,200. For most people, that's the price of a decent laptop. But for criminals moving millions of pounds worth of product every month, it was nothing. The phones had no GPS tracking, no app store, no internet browser, no cameras. They could only do one thing: send messages through a network so encrypted that even the company that made them claimed they couldn't crack it. The phones wiped themselves if tampered with. They had panic buttons that would instantly delete all data. King, Tate, and Parr joined around 60,000 criminals across Europe who were using EncroChat by 2020. They had their own usernames, their own coded language, their own digital underworld. Drug dealers in Liverpool were coordinating with suppliers in Colombia. Money launderers in London were working with transporters in Amsterdam. All through these black phones that they believed made them untouchable. What none of them knew was that their perfect system was about to become their worst nightmare. While Stephen King, Andrew Tate, and Craig Parr were building their criminal empire, European law enforcement was facing an unprecedented crisis. Crime networks were operating with complete impunity, coordinating massive operations through communications that police couldn't intercept. The criminals had become invisible. The breakthrough came from a joint operation between French and Dutch police that had been years in the making. The overall operation to infiltrate EncroChat was codenamed Operation Venetic in the UK, building on intelligence from the French and Dutch investigations. The technical details of how they cracked EncroChat remain classified to this day. What we know is that it involved a combination of advanced cryptography, social engineering, and what investigators describe as a stroke of luck that happens once in a generation. But the real genius wasn't in breaking the encryption, it was in staying invisible while doing it. For months, investigators developed a system as sophisticated as any intelligence operation. Messages were being intercepted, copied, translated, and analyzed around the clock. Teams worked in shifts, monitoring hundreds of criminal conversations simultaneously. They were essentially running surveillance on the entire European criminal underworld, including the conversations between King, Tate, and Parr. The volume of information was staggering. Over 100 million messages. Every day brought new intelligence about drug shipments, money laundering operations, and violent crimes. But what made this operation unprecedented wasn't just the scale, it was the quality of the intelligence. These weren't coded references or vague allusions. These were detailed business plans, complete with addresses, times, quantities, and financial arrangements. King, Tate, and Parr were discussing their operations with a level of openness that would have been unthinkable on any other platform. They were planning drug shipments worth hundreds of millions of pounds, discussing specific routes, exact timing, and detailed financial arrangements. Every word they typed was being recorded by the very system they trusted to keep them safe. The investigators faced a moral dilemma. Every day they delayed acting, more drugs hit the streets. But every day they waited, they gathered more evidence against criminal networks spanning the globe. The decision was made at the highest levels of European law enforcement: continue surveillance until they could strike simultaneously across multiple countries. By early 2020, investigators had identified criminal networks operating across more than 40 countries. They had evidence of drug trafficking operations worth billions of pounds. They had murder plots, corruption schemes, and money laundering operations reaching into the highest levels of legitimate society. But it was one particular thread of conversations that would lead to the biggest single drug bust in British history: the messages between Stephen King, Andrew Tate, and Craig Parr as they planned what they called the Big One. Stephen King's expertise in transportation had led him to a revelation that would define their criminal operation: rice was the perfect cover. When customs officials see a shipping container full of rice, they see one of the most mundane products in international trade. Rice feeds half the world. It's shipped by millions of tons every year. It's heavy, bulky, and completely unremarkable. Andrew Tate took King's insight and turned it into a systematic operation. Tate understood that successful crime wasn't about avoiding the system, it was about becoming part of it. They established legitimate import businesses with real shipping contracts and authentic documentation. From the outside, they looked like any other food importation company, complete with offices, employees, and genuine customers who bought their rice without ever knowing what else was hidden inside those bags. Craig Parr's role was ensuring they had the supply chain to make it work. He coordinated with South American drug cartels who provided the raw materials, processing facilities in the Netherlands where drugs were prepared and packaged, and a distribution network across Europe that could handle massive quantities. The process they developed was sophisticated beyond anything law enforcement had seen before. High-grade cocaine and heroin were vacuum-sealed into custom-made waterproof packages. These packages were then inserted into genuine rice bags using a technique that left no visible trace. The bags were resealed with industrial equipment that made them indistinguishable from factory-sealed products. Through their EncroChat messages, investigators watched as King, Tate, and Parr refined their operation over months. King would scout transportation routes, identifying the safest paths through UK customs. Tate coordinated with European suppliers, ensuring timing was perfect and documentation was flawless. Parr managed the UK distribution network, preparing dealers across the country for massive deliveries. Their conversations revealed a criminal organization that operated like a multinational corporation. They had hierarchies, territories, and business processes. They had quality control procedures, customer service protocols, and financial management systems. They were running a drug empire that generated hundreds of millions of pounds in revenue every year. The network had been operating successfully for over 5 years by 2020. They had never lost a significant shipment to law enforcement. They had never had a major security breach. King, Tate, and Parr had built what they believed was the perfect criminal enterprise, hidden in plain sight within the legitimate food trade. But their success had made them ambitious. By 2020, they were planning their biggest operation yet, a shipment so large that it would supply the entire UK drug market for months. The profits from this single operation would be worth more than most legitimate businesses make in a decade. What they didn't know was that every detail of their plan was being recorded by the very communication system they trusted to keep them safe. By early 2020, Stephen King, Andrew Tate, and Craig Parr were preparing for what their EncroChat messages called the Big One. Months of planning between the three men revealed a shipment that would dwarf anything they had attempted before. This wasn't just another drug delivery, this was their masterpiece. King would handle the transportation, using his expertise as a professional driver to move the massive shipment through Greater Manchester without attracting attention. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. He would hire an HGV, collect the consignment from a transport depot, and drive it to a processing location where the drugs would be extracted and distributed. Tate had spent weeks coordinating with their European suppliers, ensuring the timing would be perfect. The entire operation had to be completed within 48 hours to minimize risk of detection. Every detail was planned with military precision, from the exact route King would take to the backup plans if anything went wrong. Parr had prepared the distribution network that would divide the drugs across the UK within hours of arrival. The messages revealed the staggering scale of what was being planned: 1 ton of pure heroin and ketamine, with a street value of £300 million. It was more drugs than most networks handled in an entire year, all arriving in a single shipment disguised as rice imports. The criminals had spent months preparing for this moment. King arranged for legitimate trucking companies to transport the goods, using routes he knew would attract minimal attention. Tate established shell companies that existed only on paper to handle the logistics. Parr coordinated with dealers across the UK who would receive what appeared to be legitimate food deliveries. But the real sophistication was in their contingency planning. If the shipment was intercepted, they had backup plans. If key members were arrested, they had designated successors. If their communication was compromised, they had alternative coordination methods. King, Tate, and Parr had thought through every possible scenario except one: that their encrypted communications had been compromised for months. The police, meanwhile, were facing their own challenges. The scale of the operation meant coordinating with multiple agencies: Greater Manchester Police, the National Crime Agency, customs officials, and international partners. The interception would need to take place in a busy area where a large police presence would be noticed immediately. But the breakthrough came when the EncroChat messages revealed the exact route and timing of King's transport. The three criminals were so confident in their communication security that they were discussing operational details with a precision that gave police everything they needed to plan the perfect interception. Detective Chief Inspector Tony Norman and his team had been watching King since 2019, tracking him as he hired an HGV that sat mysteriously unused at an industrial site for weeks. They followed him to Thurrock Services in Essex, where he met Tate and Parr. They even watched as the three men enjoyed a beer together and spent 2 nights in a hotel, completely unaware they were under surveillance. As January 29, 2020 approached, both sides were preparing for what they believed would be the culmination of their efforts. King, Tate, and Parr thought they were about to execute the perfect crime. The police knew they were about to make the biggest drug bust in British history. January 29, 2020. Kiel services on the M6 motorway, a typical rest stop where thousands of drivers take their mandatory breaks every day. Stephen King pulled in for what he believed was just another routine stop during what would be the score of a lifetime. He had no idea that specialized police units had been watching his every move for months as part of Operation Smuggling. King had just collected his consignment from a transport depot in Dagenham. The lorry appeared to be carrying exactly what the paperwork said, 10 pallets stacked with 25-kilogram bags of rice. Each pallet looked like any other food delivery you'd see on Britain's roads every day. But months of surveillance had revealed the deadly secret hidden inside. As King settled in for his rest break, unmarked police vehicles moved into position. The intercept was swift and coordinated. When officers approached King's lorry, they found exactly what Operation Venetic Intelligence had told them to expect: rice bags that weren't quite what they seemed. The search was methodical and precise. Each bag had to be carefully examined, opened, and searched. The process was painstaking because the drugs had been so expertly concealed that even experienced officers couldn't tell which bags contained contraband just by looking at them. As the search progressed, the true scale of King, Tate, and Parr's operation became clear. Bag after bag contained not just rice, but carefully concealed packages of pure heroin and ketamine. The drugs had been vacuum-sealed into custom-made waterproof containers that were then inserted into the rice bags and resealed so expertly that even close inspection wouldn't reveal anything suspicious. The seizure was unprecedented. 1 ton of Class A and B drugs with a street value of £300 million. It was the largest mainland UK drug bust in history, representing enough narcotics to supply the entire country's illegal drug market for months. Stephen King was arrested on the spot. But the drugs were just the beginning. Hidden among the rice bags, investigators found an encrypted EncroChat phone, the very device that had been crucial to the broader Operation Venetic investigation. The phone contained evidence of the network's communications and connections to criminal organizations across Europe. Later that same day, police arrived at a farm in Preston connected to the gang. As they conducted their search, Andrew Tate unknowingly drove straight into the operation, sealing his own fate. He was arrested immediately, and officers seized another encrypted mobile phone from his possession. Craig Parr's arrest followed shortly after, as the network that had taken years to build crumbled within hours. The men who had believed they were untouchable were in custody, their encrypted communications exposed, their criminal empire in ruins. By the time the search was completed, officers had uncovered what would become one of the most significant pieces of evidence in Operation Venetic. The scale of the seizure was so large that it required specialized facilities just to catalog and store everything that had been found. The rice bag bust was just the beginning of a criminal investigation that would ultimately span years and involve hundreds of officers across multiple agencies. The arrests of Stephen King, Andrew Tate, and Craig Parr marked the beginning of one of the most complex criminal prosecutions in British history. Operation Smuggling became a masterclass in patient police work, with Detective Chief Inspector Tony Norman's team having spent over 3 months watching the suspects' every move. "We knew they were involved in criminality, and that something significant was being planned the day King hired the HGV," Norman later explained, "but it was a case of being patient and vigilant." The legal process took nearly 4 years to complete. Stephen King, the catalyst for the entire investigation, tragically died in January 2021 before he could face trial. But his role in the conspiracy was thoroughly documented throughout the proceedings, and his encrypted messages became crucial evidence against his co-conspirators. On December 7, 2023, Andrew Tate was found guilty of conspiracy to supply Class A and B drugs. Craig Parr had already pleaded guilty at an earlier hearing. On April 5, 2024, they were sentenced to a collective 34 years in prison, Tate receiving the longer sentence as the court recognized his central organizing role in the operation. The men who had trusted EncroChat with their lives discovered that their unbreakable encryption had been compromised for months. Every crime they had discussed, every shipment they had planned, every move they had made under surveillance, All of it became evidence that ensured they would spend decades behind bars. But the true impact of the King, Tate, and Parr case went far beyond just one criminal network. Their arrests became a flagship example of Operation Venetic, the UK's response to the EncroChat hack that had given law enforcement access to the communications of around 60,000 criminals across Europe. Operation Venetic resulted in over 746 arrests in its initial phase, with more than 2,600 arrests following as the investigation expanded. Over £54 million in criminal cash was seized, along with 77 firearms and more than 2 tons of drugs. In Greater Manchester alone, over 200 arrests followed from Operation Venetic, with 155 people subsequently charged for a range of drug, firearms, and money laundering offences. Detective Chief Inspector Norman reflected on the case's broader significance. This discovery is the UK's largest mainland drug seizure, and there's no denying the devastation it would have had on our communities had this product made its way to Manchester. This proactive investigation meant we were able to stop that and prevent future harm. Today, Keele Services continues to serve thousands of legitimate travellers every day. Stephen King is gone, while Andrew Tate and Craig Parr serve their sentences behind bars. Their encrypted messages, which they thought would protect them, became the very evidence that ensured they would spend decades in prison. The case remains a landmark in British criminal history, a reminder that in the digital age, no communication is truly secure, and no criminal network is truly untouchable. King, Tate, and Parr had built what they believed was the perfect crime: drugs hidden in the most innocent of products, coordinated through encrypted communications, protected by years of careful planning. But their perfect system had one fatal flaw: they trusted technology that was already in the hands of their enemies, and they underestimated the patience and dedication of the police officers who spent months watching, waiting, and building an unbreakable case against them. The rice bags that once hid £300 million worth of drugs are gone, but the story of Stephen King's fatal mistake, Andrew Tate's systematic planning, and Craig Parr's distribution network will be remembered as the day that criminals learned that even the most innocent disguise can't hide the truth forever.